Before Shakespeare's pen, before Parliament's laws, before the empire sailed across oceans and planted its flags, there was chaos, there was conquest, there was a land without a name. England, as we know it, did not always exist. It was not born in peace, nor shaped in a single moment. It was forged in fire over 1,000 years of war, betrayal, faith, famine, revolt, and rebirth. It began when Rome abandoned the island, leaving behind broken walls and forgotten gods. Then came the Anglo-Saxons, building kingdoms from ruins. Then the Vikings, setting fire to the coastlines and to the old ways. Then the Normans, rewriting the rules of kingship and carving castles into the heart of the land. For centuries, England bled. Between crown and church, lord and peasant, freedom and tyranny. But in that blood was written the story of a people who refused to vanish. This is not just a tale of kings and battles. It's the story of a nation being born, not in one glorious act, but in 12 seismic transformations that would turn a tribal island into the root of a modern world. You're about to step into a past where every decade felt like destiny, where every crown came at a price, and where the echoes of medieval footsteps still shape the ground beneath your own. 12 chapters, one island, 1,000 years of fire. Welcome to the making of England. And like all epic stories, it begins not with triumph, but with collapse. Not with the rise of England, but with the fall of something far older, Rome. Part 1. The Roman Withdrawal. The collapse of an old order, 410 A.D. In the fading light of empire, there came a silence across the isle. It was not the silence of peace, nor the stillness after battle. It was the hush of something once great beginning to crumble. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia had stood as a distant but vital province of Rome, wrapped in stone roads and guarded by legions that bore the eagle of an eternal city. From Hadrian's Wall in the north to the fortified towns of the south, Roman order had become more than military. It was identity, rhythm, and rule. But in the early years of the 5th century, the great empire that had once called itself undying was gasping under the weight of its own vastness. Pressed by barbarian invasions on the Rhine and Danube, and torn by rival emperors and civil wars, Rome was no longer the master of the world, but a struggling shell of its former self. The wolf that had suckled Romulus and Remus had grown weary. And so, in the year 410, the unthinkable happened. Rome fell, not in the metaphorical sense, not in poetic despair, but literally, violently, unmistakably. Alaric the Visigoth marched into the heart of the Western world and sacked the eternal city. Citizens wailed, senators fled, temples burned. And on the edge of that crumbling dominion, in the windswept reaches of Britannia, a terrible realization dawned. Help would not come. The letter that severed a nation. It did not arrive with thunder. No legionnaire rode to the forum to read it aloud to the people. It came, as history often does, quietly. An imperial letter, brief and final. The Britons had appealed to Rome one last time, begging for aid against the raids of the Picts, the Scots, and the Saxon pirates who prowled the eastern seas. The response from Emperor Honorius was as stark as it was historic. The cities of Britain must look to their own defense. It was the closest thing to an imperial farewell, a bureaucratic shrug disguised as imperial decree. In a single sentence, Rome absolved itself of Britannia. The province was no longer Rome's daughter. It was now orphaned. And so ended Roman Britain, not with a battle, but with abandonment. The collapse of infrastructure. The Roman departure was not immediate. It had been a slow drain, like a tide pulling back from the shore. By the late 300s, garrisons were under strength, roads unrepaired, and local administrators increasingly left to govern alone. But once the final withdrawal was confirmed, the unraveling accelerated. The intricate latticework of Roman life, its aqueducts, bathhouses, temples, and legal systems, began to erode. Not in an instant, but year by year, like stone ground down by wind. The towns, once alive with trade and discipline, now heard only the footsteps of the fearful. Villas in the countryside were abandoned or fortified like fortresses. The currency debased. Law collapsed into local power struggles. Artisans became farmers. Soldiers became bandits. A unified economy shattered into fragments. Where once Roman magistrates passed judgment under the shadow of marble, now tribal chieftains settled disputes with axe and loyalty. The return of the wild. As Roman order retreated, the wilderness advanced. Forests reclaimed farmland. Wolves and bears, creatures once hunted for sport by Roman nobles, roamed more freely. With the legions gone, the great roads became dangerous, patrolled not by soldiers, but by raiders. The Picts surged down from the north, crossing Hadrian's Wall with impunity. From the Irish Sea came the Scoti, launching raids on the western coast. And from across the North Sea came the Saxons, first as pirates, then as mercenaries, and finally as settlers. Each incursion eroded what remained of Roman confidence. The island, once a mosaic of disciplined Roman civitas, was breaking apart into tribal zones of survival and siege. And yet, amid the collapse, people endured. The Britons. Between two worlds. The Romano-British population found themselves stranded between two worlds. They had inherited the infrastructure, the language, and the customs of Rome, but lacked its protection and imperial backing. Their identity was Roman, but their reality was rapidly reverting to something far older and far more dangerous. Some towns tried to maintain Roman customs. Coins still bore the names of long-dead emperors. Latin prayers were still muttered in crumbling basilicas. Bishops still traveled between dioceses, urging unity and faith. But it was a doomed imitation, a ghost of empire haunting the ruins of its past. For many Britons, survival now meant looking not to Rome, but to the land, the sword, and the tribe. The rise of local kings. In the vacuum left by Rome, power did not vanish, it dispersed. Local warlords and former Roman officials began carving out petty kingdoms. Their legitimacy was often self-declared, their authority based on strength, wealth, or divine favor. These early kings, like Vortigern, whose name echoes through semi-mythical memory, were not emperors, but tribal monarchs with Roman titles and Celtic instincts. They fortified hills, they raised militias, they collected tribute. They built wooden halls where once there had been stone forums. In some places, Latin still lingered. In others, it vanished almost entirely, replaced by revived Celtic dialects. Christianity, which had taken root in the later Roman centuries, fractured into isolated communities, disconnected from Rome, unsure of its place in the new pagan frontier. What emerged in this time was not yet England. It was not yet even a nation. It was a battleground of identities, Roman, Celtic, Germanic, each fighting not just for land, but for the soul of the island. A world remembered in ruin archaeology tells us as much as the chroniclers. In towns like Verulamium, Londinium, and Iberacum, St. Albans, London, and York, layers of ash and abandonment speak louder than any text. We find villas left unfinished, tiles stacked but never used, graves dug hurriedly in former marketplaces, forts converted into homes, churches turned into cattle pens. The shape of decline is not a cliff, it is a slope. And yet the memory of Rome did not vanish. Even in the centuries to come, bards would sing of the golden age of law and light. Monks in distant monasteries would preserve the Latin tongue, copying texts by candlelight. And in the minds of some warriors, the hope remained that order, true order, might one day return. The legacy of the withdrawal. The Roman departure in 410 was not just a political turning point, it was a psychological rupture. The island had long imagined itself part of something greater, a province of the eternal empire, a cog in the great Roman machine. Now, it was alone. But in that solitude, something new began to gestate. The end of Roman Britain marked not just the death of a system, but the gestation of future nations. From these ruins would rise the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. From the chaos of kings would emerge law codes. From the tribal battles would come a sense of land, lineage, and loyalty. History would not remember these centuries kindly. Later chroniclers would call them the Dark Ages, a time of loss and shadow. But in truth, they were years of transformation, of forging something native from the shattered imports of empire. Epilogue. The silence before the storm. When Rome turned its back on Britannia, it did so out of necessity, not cruelty. The empire was dying, and the island was expendable. But what the Romans left behind was more than walls and coins. They left a question. What kind of land would Britain become when left to its own devices? It would take centuries to answer. The Saxons were already coming, and behind them legends would rise, of Arthur, of Merlin, of knights and swords in stone. But that is the story of another age. For now, in the year 410, the silence was absolute. No legion would march, no emperor would intervene. And in that stillness, the old world breathed its last. Yet history does not abide in silence for long. In the vacuum Rome left behind, a new voice began to whisper, then roar. Part 2. The Rise of the Anglo-Saxons. Kingdoms from the Ashes, 450–800. From the ruins of empire, new kings were born, not in marble halls, but in mud and blood. The fire that consumed Roman Britain did not leave the island barren. It scorched the stone but fertilized the soil. In the smoke and silence of the abandoned province, something ancient stirred, older than the empire, older even than the tribes Rome had subdued. It was not a revival of the past, but the birth of something unclaimed by Caesar or Christ, a new warrior culture rising from ash. This was the age of the Anglo-Saxons, a people not born of the island, but destined to shape its soul. Invaders, mercenaries, settlers. It began, as such transformations often do, with a call for help. The Britons, left vulnerable after Rome's departure, were harried by raiders from the north and west. Pictish war bands stormed Hadrian's Wall. Irish Scoti pillaged the western shores. The sea, once patrolled by imperial fleets, now delivered death in the form of pirates. In desperation, a local warlord, perhaps Vortigern, though legend clouds his name, made a fateful choice. He invited Saxon warriors from across the sea to serve as mercenaries. They came in narrow longships, armed with sea axes and shields, seeking land as much as coin. At first, they fought for the Britons. Then they fought against them. And finally, they fought for themselves. The Saxons were soon joined by kindred tribes, the Angles, the Jutes, the Frisians. Wave after wave of these Germanic peoples crossed the North Sea, not as raiders now, but as colonists, men with wives, children, livestock, gods. They came not to plunder, but to settle. The Roman walls meant nothing to them. The cities were alien, the language, foreign. What they saw was not the death of a civilization, but unclaimed land, ripe for conquest. The fall of the Britons. The Romano-British response was fierce but fractured. Disunited, without a central command, the native resistance splintered under pressure. Some fought valiantly, most notably in the Battle of Mount Badon, around the year 500, where a British war leader held back the tide. His name has been lost to history, or perhaps transformed into myth. Some called him Arthur, but even legendary valor could not halt a migration of centuries. The Anglo-Saxons advanced westward and northward, driving the Britons into the highlands of Wales, Cornwall, and Strathclyde. There, Celtic tongues and Christian rites endured in defiance, preserving fragments of the old world. But in the heartland of Britain, the future belonged to the newcomers. The Heptarchy, 7 thrones of power. By the 7th century, the island was no longer Roman and not yet English. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, each ruled by warrior kings who traced their bloodlines not to emperors or saints, but to Odin and Woden. This era is remembered as the Heptarchy, 7 principal kingdoms. Northumbria, a northern powerhouse of scholarship and steel. Mercia, ambitious and martial, hungry for dominance. Wessex, a rising star in the south, destined for future greatness. East Anglia, rooted in Anglian traditions. Essex, Kent, and Sussex, smaller yet fiercely independent. Each kingdom had its own king, its own warband, its own ambitions. Their borders shifted like tides, today allies, tomorrow enemies. And yet, amid the conflict, something extraordinary occurred. Culture. The coming of Christianity. The Saxons came with gods of thunder and war, Thunor, Woden, Tiu, and rituals rooted in the forest and the sea. But a new wind was rising across the Channel. In 597 AD, a Roman monk named Augustine landed in Kent under orders from Pope Gregory the Great. His mission, to convert the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. He came not with swords, but with scripture. Not with armies, but with arguments. At first his message found fertile soil only in Kent, whose king, Ethelbert, had married a Christian Frankish princess. But over the next 2 centuries, missionaries, bishops, and monasteries would spread the faith across the kingdoms. Some conversions were peaceful, others political. Kings saw in Christianity not just spiritual salvation, but a framework for centralized rule, literacy, law, divine right. The result was a synthesis. Pagan valor fused with Christian virtue. Monasteries arose beside mead halls. Scribes copied Latin texts, while warriors trained with spears. By the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxons were no longer purely Germanic. They were something new. The written word returns. Rome had left Britain illiterate. The Saxons arrived with no writing system of their own. But as Christianity took root, so did Latin. Monks in Lindisfarne, Jarrow, and Whitby began copying manuscripts, translating scripture, and recording laws. One of the greatest of these scholars was Bede the Venerable, a Northumbrian monk whose ecclesiastical history of the English people would preserve the memory of the island's transformation. Through Bede, we glimpse the rise of kings and saints. He tells of Oswald of Northumbria, who fought with faith and sword, of Cuthbert, a humble holy man, of a people shaping their identity between 2 worlds, the oral and the written, the heroic and the divine. Kings and law. With writing came law, not Roman law, but Anglo-Saxon codes inscribed in runes and later in Latin. Each kingdom issued its own dooms, decrees of justice. Theft, murder, and oath-breaking were no longer settled solely by blood feuds. Fines, compensations, and trial by ordeal became tools of governance. A man's worth was measured in silver, his weregild. A king's life, the highest. A slave's, the lowest. Justice was harsh, but not arbitrary. It followed custom, codified and preserved. The idea of law above man, seeded in these centuries, would echo through English history for 1,000 years. A warrior culture, refined. Make no mistake, the Anglo-Saxons were warriors. Their kings led from the front. Battles were fought not in legions, but in shield walls, tight phalanxes of spears and grit. Yet their culture was not only forged in blood, it sang in epic poetry, songs passed by scops beside hearths and fires. The greatest of these tales was Beowulf, the saga of a hero who slays monsters, seeks glory, and contemplates fate. In those verses, we glimpse their values, courage, loyalty, honor, and the inevitability of death. A worldview where life was brief, but legacy eternal. From many. 1. By the close of the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxons had transformed the island. Roman cities lay in ruin. Celtic strongholds survived in corners. But the heartland was now ruled by Saxon kings, praying to Christ and quoting laws. The heptarchy was still divided, but unity was a vision no longer absurd. Kings began styling themselves not just rulers of a people, but kings of the English. It was a fragile dream, tested constantly by ambition and war, and just as it seemed within reach, a new threat appeared on the horizon. The next storm gathers. In 793 A.D., a monastery at Lindisfarne, a symbol of learning and peace, was sacked by raiders from the sea. The monks described them with trembling pens, fierce men, cloaked in iron, wielding axes, heathens, pagans, destroyers. They were Vikings. The age of Anglo-Saxon ascendance was ending, not in decline but in challenge. The kingdoms they built, the laws they forged, the faith they embraced, all would be tested in fire, but they would not vanish. From the bones of this warrior age, a nation would rise. For just as the Anglo-Saxons had once emerged from the ashes of empire, now they would face their own crucible, carried on the tides by men who feared no cross and bowed to no king. Part 3. The Wrath of the North. Viking invasions and the struggle for England. 793–878. They came with fire and salt in their veins, not as shadows, but as a storm. The sea, which once brought trade and monks and the distant breath of Rome, changed its voice in the final years of the 8th century. The waves grew colder, the wind howled not with prophecy but with warning, and when the ships appeared, sleek, low, dragon-proud, they did not come to barter. They came to burn. The first strike. Lindisfarne, 793 A.D. It began not with an army, but with a massacre. On a wind-lashed island off the northeast coast, the sacred monastery of Lindisfarne, a beacon of Christian learning and peace, was torn apart by strangers from the sea. They were not known to the scribes, not born of the soil. They spoke no Latin, prayed to no Christ, and feared no cross. The monks died in silence or fled in horror. Chalices were stolen, altars smashed. Holy men were dragged in chains or drowned in the tide. The chroniclers did not mince words. Immense whirlwinds, lightning, and fiery dragons were seen in the sky. These signs were followed by famine, and not long after, the ravaging of God's church by heathen men. Thus did the Vikings announce themselves, not with diplomacy, but with desecration. Who were the Vikings? To the Anglo-Saxons, they were simply Danes, or Northmen, barbarians without honor or law. But history sees more clearly. The Vikings were seafarers, farmers, traders, and warriors from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Pressured by population growth, internal strife, and a hunger for wealth, they took to the seas in longships that danced across the waves faster than any Saxon vessel. They were not one people, but many clans. What united them was a spirit of boldness and a cultural embrace of risk. To raid was to rise. To fall in battle was not to perish, but to enter the halls of the slain. Theirs was a world view of honor by the sword, glory by the axe, and fate written by the gods. A new kind of war. The Anglo-Saxons were no strangers to battle. They had spent centuries forging kingdoms from blood. But the Vikings did not wage war like Saxon kings. They did not come for land, at first. They came for plunder, prestige, and payment. They struck swiftly. They struck without warning. Coastal monasteries, poorly defended but rich with silver, were ideal targets. Holy men and their relics were no match for axe and flame. Raids soon turned into regular campaigns. Jarrow, Iona, and Wearmouth were ransacked. Settlements in East Anglia and Northumbria were pillaged. The coasts of Wessex, Kent, and Mercia were laid bare. Saxon kings tried to respond, but how does one fight the sea? The Vikings could vanish as quickly as they came, until one day they chose to stay. 865 A.D. The great heathen army arrives. It was no longer a raid. In the year 865, the Anglo-Saxon world changed forever. A massive coalition of Viking forces landed on English shores, known in chronicles as the Great Heathen Army. Led by semi-legendary sons of the Norse hero Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Ubba, and Halfdan, they came not for loot, but for conquest. This was not a single war band. It was an army, organized, ruthless, and determined to carve out territory on English soil. They began in East Anglia, extracting tribute and horses. Then they marched north, capturing York in 866, a devastating blow. York, the Roman Eboracum, was one of the island's oldest urban centers. Under Viking control, it became Jorvik, a Norse city of trade and steel. From there, the Danes launched a brutal campaign. Northumbria fell. East Anglia's king, Edmund, was captured and executed, later canonized as a martyr. Mercia, long the powerhouse of central England, buckled under pressure. By the early 870s, only one kingdom remained standing, Wessex. Wessex alone. Wessex, the kingdom of the south, had watched its neighbors fall one by one. Now it stood alone against the storm. Its young king, Alfred, had already tasted defeat. In 871, he fought the Danes at the Battle of Ashdown, a partial victory, but his brother, King Ethelred, died shortly after, leaving Alfred the crown. He inherited not a kingdom, but a battlefield. For years, Alfred danced between diplomacy and war. He paid the Danes to buy peace, only to see them return. He reorganized his defenses, building fortified towns called burhs, creating a mobile defense network. He trained his armies to fight not in the old tribal style, but with discipline, timing, and strategy. But in 878, Wessex nearly died. The Crucible, 878 A.D. Alfred in the marshes. In the dead of winter, the Danes launched a surprise assault. Led by Guthrum, their armies drove deep into Wessex. Alfred was caught off guard, forced to flee into the marshes of Athelney, where he hid like a hunted animal. The legends say he disguised himself, wandered among peasants, even burned a loaf of bread while lost in thought, forgetting the cares of daily survival in the shadow of collapse. But Alfred did not break. In those cold, waterlogged lands, he began to rebuild, not just an army, but a vision. He sent messages across Wessex. He rallied men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. And when spring returned, so did the king. Battle of Edington, the turning point. In May 878, Alfred led his army against Guthrum at Edington. It was not merely a military engagement, it was a battle for the future of England. The Saxons fought with desperation, the Danes with arrogance. And when the shield walls clashed, the earth shook with the roar of fate. By day's end, Alfred stood victorious. He pursued Guthrum, forced his surrender, and offered terms not of death, but of transformation. Guthrum agreed to baptism, becoming a Christian, and withdrew to East Anglia with his followers. This was more than a military victory. It was a cultural assertion. England would not fall. The Danelaw and the new map of England. Alfred's triumph did not end Viking presence, but it redrew the political map. England became a land of two halves, Wessex and its allies in the south and west, under Saxon rule. The Danelaw in the north and east under Viking law and custom. In the Danelaw, Norse language, culture, and law took root. Place names ending in by, Thorpe, and Skeg still mark their legacy. In Wessex, Alfred began a new campaign, not of war, but of reform. He revived education, promoted literacy, translated Latin works into Old English, and strengthened defenses. He styled himself not just King of Wessex, but king of the Anglo-Saxons. He had stared into the abyss and built a bridge across it. Legacy of resistance. The Viking invasions had tested the very soul of Anglo-Saxon England. From Lindisfarne to Edington, the kingdom had known fear, ruin, and near annihilation. And yet, through that crucible, a new identity was forged. The Saxons became not just warriors, but survivors. They learned from their enemies. They adapted. And in Alfred, they found a ruler who saw beyond the moment, who laid the groundwork for unity, resilience, and a vision of England not as scattered kingdoms, but as a single realm. Epilogue. The quiet, before the unity. The Vikings would return again. The Danelaw would remain a rival force. But Alfred's victory marked the beginning of a long resistance, one that would culminate, decades later, in the creation of a united England. The wrath of the North had not been extinguished, but it had been met. And in the fire of that meeting, the heart of a nation had begun to beat. Yet a heartbeat is not enough to sustain a body. It must be nurtured, protected, and given purpose. In the shadow of Viking steel, one man stepped forward to do just that. Not with brute force alone, but with vision. Part 4. Reclaiming the Realm. Alfred the Great and the Rise of Wessex, 878 to 1066. From the marshes of despair rose a king not merely of men, but of memory, law, and future. The sword had spoken, but the war was far from over. When Alfred stood victorious at Edington in 878, it was not the end of the Viking threat. It was the pivot, the moment the tide began to turn, not with overwhelming strength, but with unshakable resolve. From the ruins of kingdoms and the scorched lands of the south, Wessex, the last great Anglo-Saxon stronghold, emerged not as a survivor, but as the seed of a nation. This is the story of how one kingdom pushed back the storm, lit the flame of unification, and carved the first outlines of what would become England. Alfred the Great, king in the shadow of collapse. Alfred had earned more than a crown. He had earned vision. In the marshes of Athelney, in the desperation of exile, he had dreamed not only of resistance, but of rebirth. After Edington, he wasted no time. He did not rest on the laurels of victory. Instead, he built. He reorganized the military into a rotating fyrd, half the men on duty, half farming, ensuring Wessex was never defenseless again. He constructed a network of fortified towns, or burhs, each no more than 20 miles apart, close enough to support one another, far enough to anchor the countryside. These were not just military bases. They were centers of law, trade, and administration. He reformed the legal code, blending Mosaic law, Christian principles, and traditional custom into a code of justice that spoke not merely to the sword, but to conscience. And perhaps most remarkably of all, he turned his attention to learning. In a world still healing from fire, Alfred sought wisdom. The rebirth of learning. The Viking raids had not only burned churches, they had crippled literacy. Monasteries were sacked, scribes murdered. Latin, once the language of law and liturgy, was dying. Alfred reversed the decline. He invited scholars from Wales, Mercia, and even across the Channel. He translated key Latin works, Boethius, Augustine, Gregory the Great, into Old English himself, making knowledge accessible to laymen. He decreed that every freeborn boy who could afford to learn must learn to read, first in English, then in Latin. He believed a nation could not stand merely on shields and spears. It must stand on law, wisdom, and shared memory. Alfred became more than a king. He became a father of English identity. The Danelaw, a divided land. Though Wessex had survived, the Danelaw still loomed. Vikings controlled vast regions in the north and east, York, East Anglia, the 5 boroughs. In these lands, Norse language, custom, and law prevailed. Towns like Jorvik, York, flourished as Viking economic centers, but unlike earlier raiders, these Vikings now ruled. They farmed, they married, they minted coins, they wrote laws. And slowly, the sharp line between Saxon and Dane began to blur. Trade flowed between Danelaw and Wessex. Diplomacy replaced swords, at least temporarily. Some Danes converted to Christianity, while Saxons adopted certain Norse customs. Yet beneath the uneasy coexistence pulsed a deeper current, a quiet struggle for the soul of the island. Who would define England? The pagans from the sea, or the Christian kings of Wessex? Edward the Elder and the Quiet Expansion, 899 to 924. When Alfred died in 899, he left behind not just a throne, but a mission. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited a kingdom still bordered by threat. But Edward was no passive heir. With his sister Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, he began the reconquest. Together, they marched on Viking-held towns, Derby, Leicester, Stamford. One by one, the old Saxon lands were retaken. Ethelfled, widowed and wise, led Mercian armies in person. A warrior queen, revered even by her enemies. Her capture of Derby was a bold stroke that shook the Danelaw. By 924, Edward had united Wessex and Mercia. The dream Alfred had nurtured, of a single English realm, was no longer fantasy. Aethelstan, the first king of all England, 924 to 939. But it was Edward's son, Aethelstan, who would take the final leap. Crowned in 924, Aethelstan was raised at Alfred's court and shaped by its vision. Fluent in Latin, devout in faith, and commanding in war, he became the first true king of the English. In 927, he captured York, finally bringing Northumbria under Saxon rule. For the first time since the Romans, the entire island south of the River Tweed was united under one crown. But unity demanded defense. In 937, a grand coalition of Norse, Scots, and Strathclyde Britons marched against Aethelstan. The battle that followed, Brunanburh, was titanic. A clash of nations, of gods and kings. The Saxons prevailed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle sang its praises in heroic verse. Never before in this island was such a slaughter of people, since the Angles and Saxons came here from the east. The nation was baptized in blood, and Aethelstan's name was immortalized. Kings and Shadows, 939 to 978. After Aethelstan, the kingship passed to his brothers and nephews, Edmund, Edred, Edgar the Peaceful. Each reigned over a realm growing in strength, law, and wealth. Under Edgar, England saw a rare peace. Monasteries flourished, coinage was standardized, naval power grew. At his coronation, even kings of Scotland and Wales paid homage, a ceremony that echoes in the modern British coronation rites to this day. But peace is never permanent. In 978, a boy of 10 took the throne. His name was Ethelred. History would remember him as Ethelred the Unready, a tragic king born into a storm. The Second Viking Age begins. While Wessex had expanded, the Norse world had changed. In Scandinavia, kingdoms were forming. In Normandy, Viking descendants ruled as dukes. And in the Baltic, new raiders once again turned greedy eyes to England. Beginning in the 980s, a second wave of Viking invasions struck the realm. This time, the raids were larger, better organized, and relentless. Ethelred, unsure and poorly advised, relied on tribute, the infamous Danegeld, to buy peace. He paid silver, but purchased only delay. In 991, the Saxons were crushed at Malden. In 994, Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark landed a full invasion fleet. The Viking threat had returned, not as raiders, but as kings in waiting. The fall of Ethelred and the death of a dream. By the early 11th century, the realm Alfred had saved and Aethelstan had built was once again under siege. In 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard declared himself King of England. Ethelred fled to Normandy. Though Sweyn died soon after, his son, Cnut the Great, would return and conquer. In 1016, Cnut defeated Edmund Ironside, Ethelred's last heir. The Danelaw was no more. The Dane was now king of the whole realm. And yet, the Saxon dream did not die. Even under Cnut, Anglo-Saxon laws, customs, and church traditions endured. The kingdom Alfred forged had roots too deep to burn. Epilogue. The final Saxon dawn. After Cnut's death in 1035, England saw years of uncertainty. His sons fought, died, and faltered. In 1042, the throne returned to a Saxon once more. Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred. Edward was a pious man, more monk than monarch. He built Westminster Abbey. He strengthened ties with Normandy, and when he died childless in 1066, he left behind not an heir, but a battlefield. Two men claimed his crown: Harold Godwinson, Saxon Lord of Wessex, and William, Duke of Normandy, descendant of Viking conquerors turned French nobles. The dream of a united Anglo-Saxon England, born in the marshes of Athelney and forged in centuries of fire, stood on the edge of its final reckoning. What began as a rebellion in the swamps had become a kingdom. But kingdoms, like kings, are mortal. And now, as England stood between rivals, a storm was crossing the Channel, one that would not just challenge the realm, but redefine it forever. Part 5. The Norman Conquest. A New England Forged in Fire. 1066. 1 year, 1 crown, 3 kings, and a single arrow that would end 1,000 years of Saxon rule. The sun rose on England in 1066 with uneasy light. For more than 2 centuries, the dream of unification had held firm. From Alfred's fire-wrought resistance to Ethelstan's realm and Edward the Confessor's quiet piety, the House of Wessex had endured the storms of Viking invasions, internal divisions, and dynastic uncertainty. But now, in the first days of January, the throne stood empty, and the winds carried whispers from the North Sea, the Channel, and beyond, that the age of the Anglo-Saxons was about to end. Edward the Confessor dies, a throne without an heir. On January 5, 1066, Edward the Confessor, King of England, died childless. Pious, aloof, and politically indecisive, Edward had failed to secure a clear succession. His death set loose a succession crisis that would plunge England into one of the most fateful years in its history. The Witan, the Council of Nobles and Clergy, moved swiftly. They chose Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex and Edward's brother-in-law, as king. Harold was not of royal blood, but he was powerful, capable, and English. On January 6th, just 1 day after Edward's death, he was crowned King Harold II of England in Westminster Abbey. But the crown rested heavy, and it would not rest long. Across the sea, 2 men sharpened swords and ambitions. 2 claimants, 2 invasions. The first came from the north, Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. A towering warrior, bred in the sagas, Harold claimed that England belonged to him by an ancient pact made between Viking kings and Harthacnut, the Danish ruler who once wore England's crown. More than that, he saw himself as the rightful heir to the Viking legacy in the British Isles. The second came from the south, William, Duke of Normandy. He claimed that Edward the Confessor, his cousin, had promised him the throne years before. Furthermore, William declared that Harold Godwinson had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim. When Harold took the crown, William called it betrayal. He vowed to take by conquest what he believed was his by right. The first storm. The Norwegians invade. In September, Harald Hardrada landed in the north with a fleet of Viking ships, joined by Harold Godwinson's own traitorous brother, Tostig. The invaders stormed into Yorkshire, defeating local forces at Fulford. It seemed the Norse had returned once more to seize England. But Harold acted with stunning speed. Marching his army over 180 miles in just 4 days, he caught the Norwegians by surprise near Stamford Bridge. There, on September 25, 1066, Anglo-Saxon steel clashed with Norse iron in a brutal, decisive battle. Harold's men fought with fury. The bridge was stained with blood. A legendary Norse warrior held the crossing alone for hours before being cut down. By day's end, Harold Hardrada lay dead, his army shattered, and the Viking Age in England, finally, was over. But even in victory, Harold could not rest. As he celebrated in the north, word arrived. William had landed. The second storm. As Normans arrive. On September 28th, Duke William of Normandy set foot on English soil at Pevensey, bringing with him an army of knights, archers, and infantry. Unlike the Viking raiders of old, these were not pagans, but Christian warriors, descendants of Norsemen who had settled in France a century earlier and learned the ways of castles, cavalry, and continental warfare. The Normans were not raiders. They were conquerors, and they came with papal blessing. The Pope had granted William a banner, declaring his invasion a holy war against an oath-breaker. Harold, exhausted from battle and forced to march his army south once again, gathered his loyal thanes and met William on October 14th, near a hill called Senlac, just outside Hastings. The battle that followed would determine the fate of England. The Battle of Hastings, 14th October, 1066. The Saxons fought on foot, shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall, the same formation that had carried them through centuries of war. With axes, spears, and blades, they held the high ground, grim and disciplined. The Normans attacked in waves, cavalry charges, volleys of arrows, feigned retreats. All morning, the Saxon shield wall held. But William adapted. He ordered false retreats, tricking Saxon soldiers into pursuit. Then his cavalry turned and cut them down. In the final hours of battle, as dusk fell and chaos reigned, a Norman arrow, fired high into the sky, struck King Harold in the eye, killing him instantly. The shield wall broke. The Saxon army collapsed. England had fallen. Aftermath, a new king, a new rule. In the months that followed, resistance flickered. But by Christmas Day, William had forced submission from the remaining nobles and was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, the same place Harold had been crowned just 11 months earlier. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically dispossessed. Lands were seized. Castles were built. Resistance crushed. The Norman elite, speaking Old French, replaced the Anglo-Saxon ruling class. A new language began to shape law, literature, and power. But William was more than a warlord. He was a builder of systems. In 1086, he commissioned the Domesday Book, a complete survey of all land, wealth, and ownership in England, a symbol of absolute control, a ledger of conquest. The end of the House of Wessex. With Harold's death, the House of Wessex, which had defended and unified England for centuries, came to an end. It died not in disgrace, but in valor, at Hastings, surrounded by kin, in the same shield wall tradition that had saved the realm from Vikings. The Anglo-Saxon age was over, but its legacy would not vanish. The laws, the language, the customs, the church. These did not burn. They blended. Norman governance merged with Anglo-Saxon resilience. Together, they gave birth to something new. An Anglo-Norman realm, ruthless in its foundation, yet rich in its legacy. Legacy. A New England William the Conqueror's reign brought feudalism, centralized authority, and closer ties to continental Europe. England was no longer a northern kingdom adrift. It was now part of the continental world. French became the language of the court. Castles rose over rivers. Taxes flowed to new lords. But the soul of England remained rooted in its Anglo-Saxon soil. Beneath the stone of Norman castles, the old tongue whispered. In the green fields and ancient churches, the memory of Alfred, Ethelstan, and Harold lingered. The conquest had changed England forever, but it had not erased it. Instead, it transformed it. Epilogue. 3 Kings, 1 year. 1066. Is more than a date. It is a turning point. Harold Godwinson, the last great Saxon king, died defending a realm forged in centuries of resistance. Harold Hardrada, the last Viking claimant, died chasing a legacy too old for the New World. And William the Conqueror, the foreign duke, rose as king, but only after fire, steel, and the prayers of soldiers. In a single year, England lost one world and was born into another. Yet conquest was only the beginning. Once the crown was claimed, another battle began. A quieter, deeper struggle for the very soul of England, waged not on the battlefield, but in the shadow of the altar. Part 6. Clash of Crown and Cross. The struggle between church and monarchy, 1070 to 1170. 2 swords ruled England, one of iron, one of faith, and when they clashed, the land itself trembled. The dust of Hastings had settled. The Saxon blood had long dried in the fields. The castles had risen, the oaths sworn, and the Norman yoke fastened tight across the land. But as England adjusted to her new masters, a new struggle began, not with the sword, but with the soul. It was a war not between kingdoms, but between throne and altar, between kings who ruled the body, and priests who claimed to rule the spirit. For a century after William's coronation, England would be shaped not only by the ambitions of its kings, but by the enduring question, who held ultimate power? God's anointed monarch, or God's church? The Norman kings and the roots of tension. William the Conqueror may have owed his crown to papal blessing, but he did not rule as a servant of Rome. His authority, like his sword, was absolute. He filled vacant bishoprics with his men, demanded oaths of loyalty from clergy, and refused papal interference in his realm. When Pope Gregory VII pushed for reform across Europe, demanding that monarchs submit to the church and that clergy answer only to Rome, William replied with a word that would echo for generations. Fealty I owe to none but God. The battle lines were drawn. Though William died in 1087, the precedent was set. The English king would not kneel. William II, the Red King and the Shadows of Rebellion, 1087 to 1100. William's son, William Rufus, William II, inherited more than the throne. He inherited the conflict. Bold, impious, and fiery-tempered, the Red King openly antagonized the church. He delayed appointing archbishops to collect church revenues for himself, and kept sees vacant to enrich the crown. When he finally appointed Anselm of Bec as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093, he expected obedience. Instead, he found resistance. Anselm, a brilliant theologian and future saint, refused to cede spiritual authority. He claimed his allegiance was to Rome, not to the king. What followed was a bitter standoff. Anselm fled into exile. William seized his lands. The king mocked the clergy, taxed the church, and even threatened Rome. But in 1100, William Rufus died, struck by an arrow in the New Forest, under circumstances still shrouded in mystery. Some called it accident, others divine judgment. Either way, a new king rose, and with him, a new chapter in the struggle. Henry I, the scholar king and the art of balance, 1100–1135. Henry I, younger brother to William Rufus, was as cunning as he was learned. Fluent in Latin, educated in law and theology, he understood both the power of the church and the danger of defying it. He immediately restored Anselm as archbishop. But peace was not simple. The two clashed over the investiture controversy, a Europe-wide battle over who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots, the pope or the king. Henry needed loyal bishops to govern. But Anselm insisted that spiritual authority could not come from secular hands. After years of careful diplomacy, a compromise was reached in 1107. The king would no longer invest bishops with the ring and staff, the symbols of spiritual office. But he retained the right to demand homage from them for their temporal lands and roles. It was a delicate balance, a truce, not a surrender. Anselm died in 1109, but his legacy endured. The church would not be merely a tool of the crown, and Henry, though victor-in-law, knew that England had changed. The anarchy, a realm without order, 1135 to 1154. Henry's heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster of 1120, leaving a succession crisis that would plunge England into chaos. When Henry died in 1135, he left the crown to his daughter, Empress Matilda. But the nobles rejected her rule, and her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the throne. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war, known as the Anarchy. Lords built castles without royal license. Regions declared near independence. The law broke down. Famine, plunder, and betrayal reigned. And amid the chaos, the church grew in stature. Bishops became mediators. Monasteries offered refuge, and the clergy, often the only educated class, preserved what little order remained. One chronicler wrote, "Christ and his saints slept, but even in sleep the church waited." And when Matilda's son, a young noble trained in Norman, Saxon, and Angevin politics, rose to claim the crown, the church would soon face its greatest challenge yet. Henry II, the lawgiver and the lightning, 1154 to 1189. Crowned in 1154, Henry II was a force of nature. Descended from the Normans on his father's side and the Saxons through his mother Matilda, Henry inherited not just England, but an empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He was tireless, brilliant, ruthless. His goal was simple: control. He strengthened royal courts, sending itinerant justices across the realm. He created common law, enforced royal authority, and curbed baronial power. But one bastion remained beyond his reach: the church. To tame it, he turned to an old friend, Thomas Becket. From chancellor to martyr. Thomas Becket was everything Henry admired: sharp, charismatic, politically savvy. As Chancellor of England, he had enforced the king's will with unwavering loyalty. In 1162, Henry appointed him Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting obedience. But Becket changed. Whether through true piety or political calculation, Becket transformed from courtier to cleric. He resigned the chancellorship, wore sackcloth, and defended church privileges with zeal. The king was stunned and enraged. Clash at Clarendon and the exile. In 1164, Henry issued the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of royal decrees aimed at curbing clerical privilege and asserting crown jurisdiction over the clergy. Becket refused to sign. A storm followed: trials, insults, exile. Becket fled to France, where he was embraced by the Pope. Henry pressured Rome, threatened excommunication, and waged a cold war of diplomacy. After 6 years in exile, Becket returned, unbowed. Murder in the Cathedral, 1170. On December 29, 1170, in the cold shadows of Canterbury Cathedral, 4 knights, acting on what they believed was the king's will, confronted the archbishop. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Henry had shouted days earlier in fury. The knights heard their summons. They struck Becket down at the altar. Blood stained the stones. A man of the church had fallen, not in war, but in sacrifice. England gasped. Europe recoiled. Within months, Becket was canonized a saint. Pilgrims came in droves. The cathedral became a shrine. Henry, racked by guilt and political backlash, walked barefoot through Canterbury in penance, allowing monks to whip him. but the damage was done. Legacy. 2 powers, 1 realm. The death of Thomas Becket did not destroy the Church. It strengthened it. Henry was forced to reaffirm ecclesiastical rights. The martyrdom made clear. There were limits to royal authority, lines that even kings could not cross without consequence. For the first time, a spiritual power had stood not just beside the monarchy, but against it. And it had won, not with armies, but with blood and memory. Epilogue. A realm of law and conscience. The century between 1070 and 1170 reshaped England. The Norman crown imposed iron law and centralized rule. The Church, battered but unbroken, emerged as a moral and intellectual force. Common law and canon law clashed, merged, and set the foundations for future English governance. And the English people, caught between throne and altar, witnessed the birth of something deeper. A kingdom where power must reckon with principle. A land where justice was no longer the sword alone, but also the soul. But ideas, once born, demand form, and principles, once awakened, demand protection. As the centuries turned, the struggle between unchecked power and emerging rights would not vanish. It would take shape in parchment and protest. Part 7. Magna Carta, The Roots of Liberty, 1215. In a meadow by the Thames, swords were sheathed not in surrender, but in the defense of a deeper law, the law of the people. It began not with freedom, but with fury, and not with... England in the early 13th century was not yet a land of liberties. It was a kingdom of kings, where power came from the crown, and law bent beneath the weight of royal will. But in the reign of King John, that power would be tested, and for the first time in English history, challenged and broken. It was not a revolution of peasants, nor a victory won on the battlefield. It was something more enduring, the written word, the sealed promise, the chartered limit. This is the story of how a tyrant's arrogance, a baron's rebellion, and a single summer led to the most famous document in the history of English liberty, the Magna Carta, the road to tyranny. King John's rise and fall. The seeds of conflict were sown in blood. King John came to the throne in 1199, after the death of his elder brother, Richard the Lionheart. A warrior king who spent more time on crusade than at court. But if Richard was lion-hearted, John was shadow-hearted, jealous, suspicious, merciless. From the start, John ruled not with honor, but with fear. He lost Normandy to the French in 1204, weakening England's hold on the continent and diminishing royal prestige. He imposed heavy taxes to fund campaigns to reclaim lost lands, wringing silver from merchants and nobles alike. He manipulated the courts, seized estates, punished dissent. Worse still, he clashed with the Church, refusing to accept Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. In response, Pope Innocent III excommunicated him and placed England under interdict, a spiritual blockade that halted all sacraments. For 6 years, England was cut off from the grace of Rome. Baptisms, marriages, burials, all suspended. A kingdom in religious limbo. Finally, in 1213, under threat of papal invasion and rebellion at home, John submitted. He did not just make peace. He surrendered England as a vassal of the Pope, paying tribute to Rome. It was an act of humiliation, and one that enraged the barons. The barons rebel. A kingdom. Divided by 1215, John had taxed the kingdom dry, alienated the Church, lost ancestral lands, and broken every promise of just rule. The barons, those great lords who had once sworn fealty, could bear no more. They gathered arms, they made demands, and they marched toward the king. But they did not seek the throne for themselves. They sought something radical, accountability. They wanted a document that would bind the king, a set of written guarantees that even the monarch could not violate. And so they met, king and rebels, not in a castle, but in a meadow. Runnymede, the birthplace of English liberty. On the 15th of June, 1215, beside the River Thames, near a place called Runnymede, King John affixed his seal to a parchment of 63 clauses. It would come to be known as the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was not written in poetry, nor spoken with fire. It was practical, detailed, legal, and yet it was revolutionary. Among its most powerful principles, no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. The Church of England shall be free. Taxes shall not be imposed without common council. It did not end monarchy, but it tamed it. For the first time in Western history, a king admitted he was not above the law. Magna Carta was not born free, it was fought for. Despite the historic moment, John never intended to honor the charter. Days after signing, he wrote to the Pope, declaring he had been forced into submission. Innocent III agreed, and annulled the charter. War broke out. The barons, enraged by John's betrayal, offered the crown to Prince Louis of France. England teetered on the brink of foreign conquest. But in 1216, fate intervened. John fell ill, struck by fever and consumed by fear. On October 19th, he died at Newark Castle, leaving the throne to his 9-year-old son, Henry III. A child king offered a second chance. William Marshall, the sword behind the charter. In this perilous hour, England found a protector in William Marshall, the Earl of Pembroke. Veteran of crusades, defender of kings, and master of diplomacy, Marshall became regent for young Henry. Rather than rule with iron, he chose wisdom. He reissued Magna Carta in 1216 and again in 1217 with minor edits, presenting it not as a document of rebellion, but of national unity. The barons, satisfied. The French, repelled. The boy king, secure. And so, the Magna Carta survived, not as the product of a king, but as a legacy of conflict, compromise, and conviction. The echo of the Charter. Beyond the 13th century, though revised and reissued many times in the coming decades, the spirit of Magna Carta endured. In 1297, under Edward I, it was incorporated into English statute law. In the centuries to come, it would inspire. The Petition of Right, 1628, limiting Charles I's power. The English Bill of Rights, 1689, solidifying parliamentary sovereignty. The U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights, drafted with Magna Carta as philosophical foundation. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, echoing its promises of due process and justice. Though medieval in its language, Magna Carta became a modern symbol, proof that liberty is not a gift from rulers but a birthright of the governed. The power of a sealed parchment. Magna Carta did not end tyranny. It did not bring democracy overnight, but it changed something deeper. It changed the imagination of power. It whispered into the hearts of free people that even kings must answer to the law, that justice must not be sold, that prison must have reason, that liberty, once written, becomes difficult to erase. Epilogue. A meadow remembered. Runnymede is quiet now. The river flows as it did in 1215, though the crowds have long gone. But the meadow remembers. Not the sound of battle, but the sound of sealing. The creak of wax, the press of ring to parchment. The moment when a king, though unwilling, set in motion the most powerful idea in English history, that the law is above all. But even as kings bent to parchment, their eyes drifted elsewhere, toward lands across the sea, thrones beyond their reach, and glory that no charter could restrain. Part 8. The 100 Years' War. A Crown Drenched in Blood. 1337 to 1453. It was not one war, but many. Not one king, but generations. And not one victory or defeat, but a reckoning of empires. The ink of the Magna Carta had barely dried into the bones of law when new fires began to burn. England, now ruled not by tyrants, but by kings, tempered by charter, sought glory beyond its shores. But this time, it wasn't rebellion they faced. It was ambition. In 1337, the Crown of England gazed across the Channel and saw France, rich, divided, and weakened by succession crisis. The bloodlines of kings crossed borders, and when inheritance became dispute, the sword replaced diplomacy. What began as a claim became a century-long storm. This is the story of the 100 Years' War, a war not of days or even decades, but of generations, a war of crowns, of honor, of ruin. The Spark. Edward III claims the French throne, 1337. The war's first seeds were political. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France through his mother, claimed a legitimate right to the French crown after the death of Charles IV. But French lords invoked Salic law, barring inheritance through the female line. The crown passed to Philip VI, a cousin of the late king. Edward, humiliated and angered, responded not with submission, but with declaration. In 1337, he formally claimed the throne of France. And so began the war. A Sea of Arrows. Crécy and Poitiers, 1346 to 1356. The English, though outnumbered and distant from home, held a secret weapon, the longbow. A weapon of the commons. Simple, swift, deadly. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, Edward's archers unleashed death upon the flower of French chivalry. Knights fell like rain. Horses screamed. Armor crumpled like parchment. 10 years later, in 1356, Edward's son, the Black Prince, captured the French king, John VI, at Poitiers. A king in chains. A nation humiliated. It seemed the English crown would soon encircle France itself. But war is not won by victories alone. Plague and Pause. The Black Death, 1348. As English fortunes soared, the heavens darkened. The Black Death arrived in 1348, a silent assassin cloaked in fleas and fear. It swept through both England and France, killing millions. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay untended. Thrones ruled over kingdoms of the dead. For a moment, both kings sheathed their swords, if only to bury their people. But ambition does not die so easily. And when the graves filled, the armies rose again. The Treaty of Bretigny. A pause, not peace. 1360. In 1360, Edward III and the French agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny. England gained vast territories in southwestern France. Edward renounced his claim to the French crown. But neither promise would hold. As soon as strength returned, France sought recovery, and Edward, in age and weariness, prepared to pass the torch. The Black Prince fades. A kingdom's star dimmed. Edward, the Black Prince, hero of Crécy and Poitiers, was England's shining blade. But illness claimed him before the throne could. In 1376, he died. A year later, so too did Edward III. The crown passed to Richard II, a child. And with the child came turmoil. Internal strife. Lords, rebels, and kings. While France rebuilt, England fractured. The rule of Richard II was marred by noble feuds, taxation, and the peasants' revolt of 1381. A mass uprising driven by plague, poverty, and rage. England's power abroad waned. In 1399, Richard was deposed by Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, a usurper's crown, a kingdom tense. The war in France had not ended. But England's heart was elsewhere, torn by rebellion and distrust. The flame rekindled, Henry V and the miracle at Agincourt, 1415. Then came a king of steel and scripture. Henry V, crowned in 1413, believed he was chosen by God to reclaim France, not as a raider, but as a rightful monarch. In 1415 he invaded. Outnumbered, weary, and deep in enemy territory, Henry's army faced the French at Agincourt. The odds were hopeless. But the mud saved England. French knights, proud and clad in gleaming armor, charged through rain-soaked fields. They bogged down. They fell. English longbows sang. By day's end, thousands of French lay dead. Henry, battered and bloodied, had performed the impossible. Agincourt became legend, and England, once more, dreamed of empire. The Crown of France, Treaty of Troyes, 1420. In 1420, Henry struck a masterstroke. Through the Treaty of Troyes, he married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French king. The treaty named him heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin, Charles VII. For a moment, England seemed destined to unite the two crowns. But fate is rarely kind to conquerors. Death of a king, Henry V. Dies and a baby inherits. In 1422, Henry V died unexpectedly, at the height of his power, just 35 years old. His infant son, Henry VI, became King of England and France in name, but was too young to rule either. The dream began to crack. France in chaos turned to a symbol, a peasant girl, Joan of Arc, the maid and the miracle. Joan of Arc was a teenage girl from Domremy who claimed to hear divine voices. In 1429, she inspired the French to lift the siege of Orléans and helped crown Charles VII at Reims, a city sacred to French kings. She wore armor. She bore a banner. She rekindled a nation's soul. Captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English, she was tried for heresy and burned at the stake in 1431. But her death became martyrdom, and France rose behind her. Collapse and retreat. England loses ground. Through the 1430s and 1440s, England's hold on France eroded. Corruption, incompetence, and Henry VI's mental instability tore the realm apart. By 1453, England had lost almost all its French holdings, save for the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War ended not with treaties, but with exhaustion. France had survived. England had failed. Legacy, the end of an era, the birth of identity. The 100 Years' War reshaped both kingdoms. For France, it was a crucible of unity, transforming a feudal patchwork into a centralized state. For England, it was a slow disillusionment. Gone were the dreams of empire. In their place, internal collapse. The return of defeated soldiers, empty treasuries, noble resentment. It was the calm before another storm, one not across the sea but at home. Soon, England would tear itself apart in civil war, the Wars of the Roses. But even amidst defeat, something new had been born. A sense of English identity, not as Norman lords ruling French lands, but as English, with their own tongue, heroes, saints, and stories. Epilogue. More than a war. The 100 Years' War was not just one conflict. It was 116 years of battles, truces, and betrayals. A chessboard of dynasties and strategies, a stage for common archers and crowned kings, a birth pang of modern France, a graveyard of England's continental ambitions. And yet, from its ashes rose something stronger than land, the soul of a nation. But even as the sword was sheathed and the banners lowered between campaigns, a darker fate approached, one that no knight could stop, no charter could prevent, and no king could conquer. Part 9. The Black Death. The Price of Progress. 1348 to 1350. It came not with banners or soldiers, but on the backs of rats and the breath of wind, and reshaped a kingdom more than any war ever could. England had faced kings who lied, lords who rebelled, and foreign armies who ravaged its shores. But in 1348, it met a different adversary. One without a sword, one with no name, only death. Not the noble death of battlefields or martyrdom, but a creeping, choking, blackened death, one that crept into homes, sanctuaries, and palaces alike. It was the Black Death, the deadliest plague in human history. And in just 2 years, it would remake the soul of England. The serpent arrives. Summer of 1348. The first whispers came from the coast. In June 1348, ships landed at Melcombe Regis in Dorset, among the cargo, wool, grain, and fleas. The pestilence had already devoured towns in Italy and France. Now it came ashore in England. It spread swiftly, as if carried by fear itself, from Dorset to Bristol, from London to York. No road, forest, or river could slow it. Within weeks, death moved faster than sermons or swords, and it was merciless. The symptoms: death with a name. People began to collapse in the streets. Fever, vomiting, pain. Then came the swellings, buboes, black boils that oozed and festered, in the groin, under the arms, along the neck, some as large as apples. The stench was unbearable, the agony unrelenting. Most died within 3 days, and there was no cure, no prayer, no answer. The physicians bled, the clergy preached, the people ran, but there was nowhere to go. A kingdom paralyzed. As death crept north, England froze. Farms were abandoned, crops rotted in the fields, markets fell silent, merchants vanished. The courts ceased, justice delayed, then forgotten. The church mourned, whole monasteries wiped out. Parliament itself adjourned. London was a city of shadows. Even the king, Edward III, retreated in fear. Royal proclamations rang hollow when priests and physicians fell by the hundreds. Every tolling church bell announced another soul lost. By early 1349, it was said 1/3 of England was gone. Some villages lost everyone. Entire families died in a single week. And yet the world kept turning. Despair and the question of God. Why? That was the word on every tongue. Was it divine punishment? The wrath of heaven for pride, war, and sin? Flagellants, fanatics with whips, marched through towns, beating themselves bloody, begging for absolution. Others blamed the Jews, accusing them of poisoning wells, leading to pogroms and massacres across Europe. In England, the Jewish population had already been expelled decades earlier. But fear still needed a scapegoat, and still, the plague marched on. The faithful prayed harder, the rich fled farther, the poor buried faster. The plague was not just killing bodies, it was shattering certainty. God's silence was louder than any sermon. The price of death, social collapse, and awakening. By mid-1350, the pestilence began to recede. The death toll was staggering, up to 50% of England's population, perhaps more in some towns. But death was only half the story. When the survivors stepped from their doors, they did not see England as it had been. They saw a new world. Land lay empty. With so many dead, entire estates went untended. And labor became precious. A single plowman could now bargain with a lord. Wages rose. Peasants, once voiceless, now had leverage. Feudal order cracked. Old oaths meant less when entire noble lines had perished. Cities changed. Skilled workers were in demand. Guilds restructured. Commerce evolved. The manor system, which had bound generations in unyielding chains of labor, began to unravel. What plague had destroyed, the survivors rebuilt, but on new terms. The ordinance of laborers. The elite. Strike back. The nobility, fearing the rise of the commoner, pushed back. In 1349, Parliament passed the Ordinance of Laborers, a law that fixed wages at pre-plague levels, forbade peasants from seeking better pay elsewhere, threatened punishment for those who broke the social order. But it was too late. The Black Death had shattered the psychological contract between lord and laborer. The poor had seen too much, buried too many, survived too deeply. They no longer feared their betters. They had nothing left to lose, and this would smolder into open revolt in the years to come. Cultural rebirth in the shadow of death. Paradoxically, the plague also sparked intellectual and cultural transformation. Art turned darker. Skeletons danced in frescoes. Skulls appeared in manuscripts. Death became a companion. Religion became more personal. Many questioned the authority of the church, whose prayers had failed to stop the plague. Literature flourished. From this soil would one day grow the works of Chaucer, who captured the voice of a changing society. The trauma etched itself into the English soul and redefined what it meant to live, to die, and to be free. The Black Death was not the end. It was the beginning. Though it lasted barely 2 years, the Black Death carved a before and after into English history. Before, a world of rigid order, of feudal loyalties, of divine hierarchy. After, a world of questions, of mobility, of possibility. The old world had died. The new one had yet to be born. But the plague had cleared the space, and in that space, the modern English mind would slowly take root. Epilogue. A kingdom changed forever. The Black Death was not a punishment. It was not a judgment. It was a reckoning. A reminder that all human systems, empires, crowns, churches, and cities are fragile. But from the ashes, something grew. The seeds of labor rights. The weakening of feudal chains. The rise of a questioning, independent spirit. The birth of dignity in the lowest of men. This was not the plague's mercy. It was the people's victory, for having endured. They did not write charters. They did not carry swords. They carried bodies. And through the silence of their suffering, they changed the course of English history. But silence does not last forever. What suffering had buried, injustice would awaken. And in the years that followed the plague, the ground itself would shake, not from disease, but from footsteps. Part 10. The Peasants' Revolt. The Cry of the Oppressed. 1381. They came not with crowns but calloused hands, not with titles but truth, and for one fleeting moment the earth trembled beneath the march of the forgotten. England had survived the Black Death, but survival came at a cost. The dead were buried, but the old order was not. Lords still ruled, kings still taxed. And though half the kingdom had vanished beneath the soil, the weight of the crown pressed heavier than ever. It was not plague that would bring England to the brink again. It was injustice. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was no accident. It was not mere riot or disobedience. It was a reckoning. A voice rising from the fields, from the workshops, from the slums and shires, crying out, "Enough!" Seeds of revolt, a boiling pot. In the years after the Black Death, England had changed, but its rulers refused to admit it. With so many dead, labor became rare and valuable. Peasants, once bound to lords by feudal chains, began demanding higher wages and freedom to move. They knew their worth now. The nobility responded with fear. Parliament passed laws, like the Statute of Laborers, 1351, which froze wages at pre-plague levels and criminalized labor mobility. It was an attempt to turn back time, but time and history would not be shackled. Taxation and tyranny. The poll tax of 1381. What finally lit the fuse was taxation. England's crown, under the regency of powerful lords ruling for the young King Richard II, needed money to fund the endless war with France. And so they imposed a poll tax, a flat charge on every person over the age of 15, rich or poor. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The last poll tax in 1381 was especially brutal, 4 pence per head, regardless of income. In modern terms, it was like asking a beggar to pay the same as a baron. When tax collectors came to Essex and Kent, they did not just take money. They searched homes, harassed women, and humiliated villagers. And finally, the people rose. The uprising begins. Essex and Kent ignite. In May 1381, peasants in Essex attacked the king's officials. Soon after, Kent exploded. Led by Wat Tyler, a former soldier and man of burning conviction, the people armed themselves, not with polished steel, but with pitchforks, axes, and righteous fury. They marched on Canterbury, then London. Thousands joined. Villagers, craftsmen, women, apprentices, not anarchists, but working people who believed the world had failed them. They did not just want revenge. They wanted justice. The March on London. A kingdom trembles. By June 1381, tens of thousands of rebels reached London. The gates were opened from within, for many in the city shared their anger, and what followed was chaos. The Savoy Palace, home of the king's hated advisor John of Gaunt, was burned to the ground. Tax records were destroyed. Jails emptied. Archbishops and chancellors, symbols of royal corruption, dragged into the streets and executed. But even in rage, the rebels displayed order. Looting was forbidden. Justice, not lawlessness, was the goal. At their heart was a radical idea. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was not just a question. It was a revolution in verse. The Boy King and the Commoners, Richard II at Mile End. On June 14th, young King Richard II, just 14 years old, rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. It was a scene unlike any in English history. A boy king surrounded by thousands of angry peasants, unarmed, unguarded, and he listened. They demanded an end to serfdom, abolition of labor laws, pardons for the rebels, removal of corrupt royal officials. To their astonishment, the king agreed. He promised charters of freedom, reforms, and peace. The crowd erupted in joy. But Wat Tyler wanted more. Smithfield, the blade falls. The next day, June 15th, Tyler met Richard again. This time at Smithfield. He spoke boldly. Some say too boldly. Accounts differ, but in the midst of talks, tensions flared. The king's men, possibly seeing Tyler as too dangerous, struck him down. Mortally wounded, Tyler fell from his horse. The rebels surged forward. Panic gripped the crowd. But then, something astonishing. Young Richard rode forward alone, calling, "I am your king. Follow me." And they did. He promised again that their demands would be met. He led them away from battle, back to the fields. For a moment, peace was preserved by courage, not conquest, betrayal. Promises burned. But kings are not bound by oaths to peasants. As soon as the threat passed, Richard revoked every promise. The rebel leaders were hunted down, tried, and executed. Some drawn and quartered, others beheaded and displayed as warnings. Wat Tyler's head was placed on a spike at London Bridge. The revolution was over, or so it seemed. The legacy, a dream that would not die. The revolt had failed, militarily, but it succeeded spiritually. The lords knew the world had changed. They had seen their walls breached, their laws ignored, their power shaken. Though serfdom was not abolished in 1381, it began to wither in the years that followed. Wages continued to rise. Workers moved freely. Landlords negotiated. The old feudal bonds had cracked beyond repair. The cry of the peasants, though silenced in flesh, echoed in law, in policy, in conscience. They had taught kings to fear the people, and they had reminded the people of their strength. Epilogue. Not a failure, but a flame. The peasants' revolt did not rewrite the laws of England, but it rewrote the imagination of its people. It proved that even the lowliest plowman, when moved by justice, could make a kingdom tremble. It laid the spiritual groundwork for revolutions centuries later, for civil war, parliamentary reform, and even modern democracy. For in 1381, the poor of England stood tall, not as beggars, but as citizens. And their story is not one of failure. It is one of fire, brief, fierce, and unforgettable. But as the fire faded and the plowshares returned to earth, a colder war took root, not between classes, but within the crown itself. For while the people dreamed of justice, the nobility dreamed of power. And the throne, once stabilized by blood, law, and prayer, was about to be split by ambition. Part 11. The Wars of the Roses. Blood on English Soil, 1455 to 1485. What the sword could not claim abroad, ambition sought at home, and England, once a realm, became a battlefield. The peasants had risen and been silenced. The Black Death had torn society apart and rebuilt it on uneasy ground. The 100 Years' War had drained coffers, hope, and heirs. And now, after centuries of foreign conquest and rebellion, England turned on itself. For 30 years, two royal houses, Lancaster and York, waged war not for territory, not for survival, but for a crown. The Wars of the Roses were not just about kingship. They were about legitimacy, inheritance, and the price of power when bloodlines fracture. This was not a medieval war. This was a dynastic firestorm, and it would change England forever. The house divided, Plantagenet blood, rival thrones. Both the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, white rose, traced their lineage to Edward III, whose long and powerful reign, 1327 to 1377, had masked the seeds of future division. After the death of his son, the Black Prince, the crown passed to Richard II, who was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, now Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. It was a usurpation masked as justice, and the Plantagenet bloodline would never forget. By 1455, Henry VI, a fragile and pious man, prone to mental collapse, wore the crown of England, but not the strength to rule it. And that is when the House of York struck. First Blood, the Battle of St. Albans, 1455. The first clash came at St. Albans. Richard, Duke of York, claimed that he sought only to remove corrupt advisers from around the king, not to take the throne. But steel spoke louder than diplomacy. The Yorkists defeated the Lancastrians in a swift and bloody fight. Henry VI was captured. Power shifted, but peace was fleeting. For once, swords are drawn in England. They are not easily sheathed. The Mad King and the Queen of War. Henry VI's bouts of mental illness left power in the hands of his queen, Margaret of Anjou. She was no passive consort. Fierce, intelligent, and ruthless, Margaret became the beating heart of the Lancastrian resistance. Her loyalty to her son, Prince Edward, knew no bounds, and she would burn the kingdom before letting Yorkist hands touch the crown. The rise of the Yorkists. Edward IV seizes the crown. In 1461, the war escalated into a thunderous confrontation at Towton, one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, with as many as 50,000 men in the field. Snow turned red. Rivers ran thick with blood. When the smoke cleared, the Lancastrians were crushed. Edward, son of Richard of York, proclaimed himself King Edward IV. Tall, charismatic, and a soldier of renown, Edward ruled with strength, but not without scandal. His secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, enraged his noble allies. Even within victory, fractures began to form. The Kingmaker, betrayal from within. Enter Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. Once Edward's staunchest ally, Warwick turned against him when political alliances collapsed. In a stunning reversal, he joined forces with Queen Margaret and restored Henry VI to the throne in 1470. But kings do not return from madness. Henry was a ghost, more puppet than sovereign. Within a year, Edward struck back. In 1471, at Barnet and Tewkesbury, the Yorkists crushed their enemies. Warwick was slain. Margaret was captured. Prince Edward was killed. Henry VI, the broken king, was murdered in the Tower of London. Peace, it seemed, had finally returned. Richard III, the princes in the Tower. Edward IV ruled until 1483, then died suddenly, leaving behind two sons, Edward V, aged 12, and Richard, Duke of York, aged 9. The boys were placed in the Tower of London for their protection. They were never seen again. Power passed to their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who claimed the throne as Richard III. Whether he murdered his nephews remains one of the great mysteries of English history. But whispers spread like wildfire. A king who rose over the bones of children is rarely loved. Richard III ruled with military skill, but his reign was cursed with mistrust. And in the West, a storm gathered. Henry Tudor, the last rose blooms. The final challenger came from exile. Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian with a thin claim to the throne, landed at Milford Haven in 1485 with a small army and a huge gamble. He marched to Bosworth Field. There, he faced Richard III. On August 22, 1485, the battle began. Richard charged with fury, seeking to kill Henry himself. A bold move, a final act. But betrayal cost him everything. The Stanley family, waiting on the sidelines, switched sides mid-battle. Richard was killed, the last English king to die in battle. His crown was found under a bush and placed on Henry's head. The Wars of the Roses were over. The birth of the Tudors. Unity at last. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, uniting the red and white roses. Lancaster and York, two bleeding dynasties, were bound in peace at last. He founded the Tudor dynasty, a line that would bring stability, ambition, and the Renaissance to England. But the scars of civil war never fully healed. For 3 decades, Englishmen had killed Englishmen, fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, and all for a crown that could never truly be held in peace. Legacy. When England fought itself, the Wars of the Roses were not wars of conquest, nor of principle. They were wars of inheritance, betrayal, and family, yet their impact was immense. They ended feudal warfare as a noble pastime. They weakened the power of the great barons. They centralized royal authority under the Tudors. They reshaped the nation's view of monarchy from divine right to human fallibility, and they left behind one chilling lesson. The greatest threat to a kingdom often lies not across the sea, but within its own blood. But even from that blood, something new would rise. For in the final clash of roses, white and red, England was not merely choosing a king. It was closing a chapter. One written in Latin and lance, and opening another in ink, reform, and fire. Part 12. The Dawn of the Tudors. England's March out of the Middle Ages, 1485. From the wreckage of roses and rebellion rose a crown unbroken by barons, a crown that would drag England from the shadows of feudal blood into the fierce light of a new age. Fontanan I. Bosworth, The End of an Age. On a humid August morning in 1485, the clash at Bosworth Field echoed not just with the cries of dying men, but with the last breath of medieval England. There, the armored specter of King Richard III, sword raised, charged toward a man history had barely known until now. Henry Tudor, an exile, a survivor, a distant descendant of royalty. It was not just a battle of claimants. It was a battle of centuries. Feudal ambition faced administrative strategy. Bloodline faced calculated legitimacy. And when Richard fell, betrayed by his own nobles, so too did the age of chivalry, castles, and baronial warlords. The Middle Ages, for England, ended in a muddy Leicestershire field beneath a summer sky, and rising from that field, crowned with a circlet found in a thorn bush, was King Henry VII, the first of the Tudor kings, the father of modern England. 2. A crown forged in compromise. Henry Tudor did not come to power with overwhelming armies or overwhelming bloodline. He came with strategy, alliance, and an understanding that to rule England in peace, one had to rebuild it from the bones outward. He declared himself king not by birthright, but by right of conquest, a medieval tradition, but quickly anchored his legitimacy in law, tracing his claim to the ancient Lancastrian line. But his masterstroke, the act that turned a fragile claim into a symbol of unity, was this. He married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, and the White Rose of the Yorkist cause. In that marriage, the roses of war, red and white, were fused. Out of their union was born the Tudor rose, emblem of peace by force, of unity through blood, and of a new dynasty that would sever the past, even as it built upon its ruins. 3. Ending feudal England. The Quiet Revolution. Henry VII knew one truth above all. England could not survive another war of nobles. The Middle Ages had been dominated by powerful barons, each with private armies and shifting loyalties, whose feuds had plunged the realm into chaos for over a century. That era was over. Henry began to dismantle the feudal web piece by piece. He passed laws restricting retaining, the hiring of private armies. He used financial bonds and recognizances to keep nobles under royal control, making rebellion too costly to risk. He centralized justice, creating royal courts that weakened the old manorial systems. And through marriage alliances, confiscations, and attrition, he reduced the number and power of England's old noble houses. He did not need to raise his sword often. His greatest weapon was bureaucracy, and through it, the medieval baron died, not in battle, but in silence. 4. The rise of the royal state. In the place of baronial power, Henry raised something new, the royal state. He expanded the exchequer, monitored trade with obsessive precision, and built a new class of loyal civil servants, educated men of modest birth, beholden only to the crown. He invested in naval infrastructure, building the ships that would one day carry English ambition to every ocean. He empowered the court of the Star Chamber, a feared judicial body that prosecuted powerful nobles when traditional courts dared not. These were not the acts of a medieval king. These were the acts of a modern ruler. And in every decision, every calculated risk, he ensured that no magnate could ever again challenge the throne. V. The return of wealth. From plunder to prosperity. The England that emerged under the Tudors was not rich in territory or gold, but Henry would make it rich in trade, order, and policy. Gone were the days of expansionist war for land. Instead, Henry strengthened trade relations with France, Burgundy, and Spain. Debts protected the growing merchant classes, especially the merchant adventurers, who began to reshape London into a rising economic power. Invested in urban growth, allowing towns to expand beyond medieval walls. Imposed tight control over coinage, ensuring financial stability after decades of war. Under Henry, England earned more than it conquered. The sword gave way to the seal. 6. Foreign policy through marriage, not war. Unlike his Plantagenet predecessors, Henry avoided the lure of reclaiming French lands or dominating continental politics through arms. Instead, he mastered dynastic diplomacy. He signed the Treaty of Etaples, 1492, with France, earning annual payments for English non-interference. He arranged the marriage of Prince Arthur, his heir, to Catherine of Aragon, tying England to the powerful Spanish kingdoms. And he skillfully played continental powers against one another, keeping England out of expensive wars while securing its influence. It was foreign policy with the quill, not the crossbow. And it worked. By the time of his death, no foreign army had set foot on English soil, and no English soldier had died for a French crown in decades. 7. The final curtain of the Middle Ages. Though modernity often arrives in whispers, not horns, the signs were clear. The printing press, imported under Yorkist kings, now flourished, spreading books, Bibles, and Renaissance ideas. Monastic power, once untouchable, began to feel pressure from royal oversight. New philosophies from Erasmus and continental thinkers began to filter into English universities. A new generation, skeptical, ambitious, literate, was rising. And though Henry VII remained personally conservative in religion, the world around him was becoming Protestant in thought, capitalist in ambition, and imperial in imagination. When he died in 1509, he left behind a country with a full treasury, a secure throne, a loyal nobility, a professional bureaucracy, and a monarchic ideology rooted in law, not just lineage. This was no longer the realm of barons, castles, and crusades. This was England on the cusp of empire, of reformation, of Renaissance. 80. The verdict of history. A quiet giant. Henry VII is rarely placed beside his son Henry VIII or granddaughter Elizabeth I in grandeur. He built no empires, fought no famous battles, and composed no anthems. But he did something greater for England's long-term future. He ended the Middle Ages not with a blaze, but with control, vision, and iron will. He turned feudal England into a nation-state. He replaced the sword with the pen, the warlord with the clerk, the rebel noble with the crown's servant. And he created the Tudor dynasty, whose heirs would go on to conquer the seas, rewrite the faith, and birth the modern world. But to understand what the Tudors inherited, we must look back, not just to one king or one war, but to the 1,000 years of fire that shaped the island they would rule. For the end of the Middle Ages was not a single moment. It was the final spark of a long and brutal forging. The end of the Middle Ages, England. Forged in fire. For over 1,000 years, England stood in the forge of time, an island torn by invasion, bound by blood, ruled by sword, and shaped by vision. From the day the Roman eagles withdrew in 410 AD, leaving behind crumbling walls and forgotten gods, the land passed through fire and darkness. It fell into the chaos of warring tribes, only to be reborn beneath the banners of Anglo-Saxon kings who built their realms from ashes and legend. But peace was fleeting. The Viking longships came next, carrying the fury of the north. They did not just raid, they changed the land, and in their wake rose Alfred of Wessex, the first to dream of an England united, not by bloodline, but by language, law, and land. Then came the storm from Normandy. In 1066, William the Conqueror reshaped the realm in fire and stone. Castles pierced the sky, French replaced English at court, and a new feudal order was carved into the soul of the nation. England became a crossbreed of conquest and tradition, a battleground for kings, popes, and people. From Thomas Becket's martyrdom to the sealing of Magna Carta, the struggle between church and crown, tyranny and liberty, cracked the old order. Even the mightiest monarchs were reminded, power must kneel before law. Then came the endless thunder of the 100 Years' War, fought not just for thrones, but for identity. It forged new weapons, new nationalism, and a class of common men who bled beside lords and began to question the divine right of kings. The Black Death followed, as death darkened every doorway. But even plague could not silence the will to survive. The peasant rose from the dirt, no longer just a tool of the land, but a voice that roared in Wat Tyler's revolt, crying, "We are men too!" And finally, when brothers turned blades against brothers, and the roses bled red and white, the last breath of feudal England was drawn. At Bosworth Field, the medieval world exhaled. And when Henry Tudor crowned himself king with a circlet found in a hawthorn bush, a new age began. No longer would England be a chessboard for barons. No longer would kings be puppets of Rome. No longer would faith, land, or destiny be inherited without question. From now on, England would be ruled by monarchs who built, not just battled. By minds who saw not just territory, but a nation of ideas. From scattered tribes to a sovereign state. From wooden halls to royal courts. From oral legend to written law. From divine right to negotiated power. From bloodline to bureaucracy. From shadow to sovereignty. This was the journey of medieval England, not merely a passage through time, but a trial of the soul of a kingdom. And when it emerged, scarred, defiant, and unbroken, it was no longer medieval. It was England.